So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Simon Wiesenthal lecture tonight, and I am happy to chair this event. And I will start with a quote of Rebecca Jinks. Paradigms are often also normative frameworks, and certainly the Holocaust seems to have exerted a normative pull on the ways in which other genocides are imagined, understood, represented, and responded to the West. So this is the main thesis of Rebecca Jinks' book on representing genocide. And it examines the way in which representations on the Holocaust have influenced the way in which other genocides are understood and represented, focusing on the canonical cases of genocide, Armenia, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda, and the process by which they became canonized using films, literature, photography, and memorialization. The Wiesenthal Institute has a decent tradition to understand this normative framework of Holocaust remembrance. As you probably remember, many of our Thursday lectures discuss different and sometimes controversial aspects of the memory politics and historiography of the Holocaust, ranging from Spain through France to Russia, with such speakers as José Faraldo, Dominic Tambour, Irina Sherbakova, Jeffrey Alexander, and Dan Stone, Nathan Snyder, or Dick Moses. I'm sure Rebecca's presentation will be an important contribution to this debate. Rebecca Jinks is a historian of comparative genocide and humanism. Before returning the Royal Holloway, where she completed her doctoral degree in 2013, she taught in the history departments of University of East England and University of Exeter. Her PhD thesis was published in 2016 by Bloomsbury, entitled Representing Genocide, the Holocaust as Paradigm. I can also show up the book again. And she is currently working on a project encompassing gender, humanitarianism, and photography in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. This research project is part of a broader monograph on the social history of humanitarianism after World War I. So, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
My thanks to Bella and to Eva for inviting me to give this Simon Wiesenthal lecture. It's an absolute privilege to be speaking here tonight. I've as you have just seen, taken the title of this lecture from the title of my book. The lecture that I'll give tonight is very much a synthesis of the arguments in this book. I would also note, I suppose, that it's comparative and therefore it's quite difficult to fit things into a 1-hour lecture. So I'm really happy to expand on them for the questions afterwards. Yeah, oh. Gotcha. Okay. In his 2008 book, Identity Politics in the Age of Genocide, David B. MacDonald writes, "The Holocaust has become the preeminent symbol of evil in the modern world, encouraging other groups to copy its vocabulary and imagery, while sometimes contesting its significance. Representation of the past can thus become a contest. In so doing, they trivialize the Holocaust and the unique suffering of the group they represent." A year later, Michael Rothberg argued in his well-known book, Multidirectional Memory, that far from blocking other historical memories from view in a competitive struggle for recognition, the emergence of Holocaust memory on a global scale has contributed to the articulation of other histories. Ultimately, memory is not a zero-sum game. What these two quotes show is that as well as the memory battles being fought within the arena of Holocaust memory over what should be remembered by whom and how, battle is also being done over the place of Holocaust memory within wider memory cultures, between groups who refer to the Holocaust when they tell their own histories of oppression and others who would jealously guard against this sort of plagiarism. And MacDonald is evidently one of the latter. In his book, he's mostly concerned to list and criticize the groups who he accuses of copying the Holocaust's vocabulary. In his words, cloaking and framing their own suffering in the vestments of the Holocaust in order to gain recognition for their own histories of oppression. And he gives the examples of Armenians, indigenous groups in Australia, America, and New Zealand, and the various ethnic groups in the former Yugoslavia. For example, some people will use relatively crude equations between Hitler and other genocidal leaders, like on this poster, which shows Talat Pasha on the left there. They will also perhaps make references to Pol Pot or Milosevic as an Asian or a Balkan Hitler. Others have written of Rwandan Nazism, and you can see from the front page of the Daily Mirror here that Belsen is being used to describe one of the concentration camps that was discovered in Bosnia in the summer of 1992. So MacDonald and the other scholars who take this approach are correct. This kind of borrowing does happen. But what's implicit, if not explicit, within their critiques is a form of border patrol, an indignation at the appropriation of the Holocaust as a strategy of identity politics. For MacDonald, such plagiarism risks trivializing and minimizing the Holocaust and its uniqueness. I would like to follow the spirit of Michael Rothberg's multi-directional memory, however, and to take a more open and less moralizing approach to these overlaps and intersections between representations of the Holocaust and representations of other genocides. Rothberg's book explores the interaction of memories of the Holocaust, decolonization, and racism, but I am primarily interested in representations of other genocides. In the scholarly literature on comparative genocide studies, which has been growing since the 90s, there has been a continual debate in the past couple of decades about the conceptual constraints of using the Holocaust as the paradigm case of genocide, and the conceptual distortion and silences that can produce. Likewise, in the last few decades, we've seen an outpouring of scholarly analysis of Holocaust memory, literature, films, memorials, and graphic novels, but few scholars have explored where and how these very sophisticated theories might be applied across to other genocides. So my aim is to bring these two analytical positions together and to explore how representations of other genocides have been constructed and how they might be received when the Holocaust is such a cultural benchmark. I will focus on the Armenian, Cambodian, Bosnian, and Rwandan cases, and I'll explore, as Eva said, how they're represented in film, literature, memorials, and photography. These four cases are perhaps the best known cases after the Holocaust. They're almost a canon in themselves. My intention here is to decode how their representation has contributed to that canonization, and at the same time to provide a critique of this canonization. So I focus on these four mediums, film, literature, photography, memorialization, in part because they're usually created sometime after the event, unlike news media responses, which are more instant, and they therefore also remain in the public domain for much longer. They can give us insights into both the intentions of the artists and the dissemination of ideas throughout Western society, since filmmakers and writers and so on are hoping to chime with or to interact with the public's understandings of genocide. My key questions are: how and how far has the Holocaust and its representation influenced the representation of other genocides? How might Westerners respond to these representations, given that Western memory cultures have largely internalized the Holocaust as such an essential part of European memory? Of course, to speak of the West and Westerners here is to speak of a vast number of people who are infinitely divisible by nation, by cultural background, religion, gender, generation, education, politics, and so on. The sheer range of that divisibility means that the national is actually not the only prism through which to view culture or representations, even though national histories and national cultures do strongly inflect individual works. But representations are never produced in cultural isolation. And as Sharon MacDonald has argued in relation to museums, these representations are also refracted through concepts and debates from elsewhere. They're often undertaken in awareness of a potential international gaze. So while Holocaust memory might not exactly be globalized then, I do think that Westerners largely share an idea of the Holocaust's basic scenario, and this surely informs how they respond to other genocides. Throughout the lecture, I will make an analytical distinction between what I call mainstream representations of genocide and more engaged representations. Mainstream genocide representations intend to appeal to and have appeal for a wide popular audience, and what I argue is that they largely replicate the Holocaust's representational framework. There's an overlap. They also follow mainstream Holocaust representations in portraying genocide as a fundamentally exceptional and abnormal event. By contrast, the more engaged representations tend to think precisely about genocide's ordinariness. They often, but not always, originate in the countries that have experienced genocide. And by following ordinary people's lives and experiences, they show that genocide is a process that arises from a conjunction of very ordinary factors which are common to or possible in every society, which could be social conflict, economic difficulties, exclusivist politics, and real or perceived crisis and tensions. So in this way, more engaged representations also decenter the Holocaust as a paradigm genocide. So throughout, I'm concerned with the ways in which genocide is distanced from or made closer to Western society. So I will begin by exploring Western public understanding of the Holocaust and what I call its basic scenario, before I turn to the representations, the mainstream representations of the other genocides. My argument is that the Holocaust influence on these representations is not really to be found at the level of explicit references or comparisons, as MacDonald would argue. Instead, the Holocaust's influence is to be found in much deeper structural similarities that shape and define many representations of genocide, and thus also Western understandings. In mainstream representations, these deeper structural similarities are to be found in how the perpetrators are represented, how the victims, the process of genocide and its aftermath are represented. And together, this is what I call the genocide script. Towards the end, I will draw some conclusions about what this means for the public understanding of genocide and what the canonization of these particular 4 cases means for others who do not fit this script. And finally, I'll conclude by showing some more engaged representations and how they disrupt this framework. Public understandings of the Holocaust have, of course, evolved since 1945. It's equally obvious that the descendants of perpetrators or collaborators, bystanders, victims, will negotiate the meaning of the Holocaust very, very differently. But amongst the infinite personal and national variations, I argue that a common understanding of the Holocaust scenario, its basic scenario, has emerged, with relatively set ideas about the perpetrators, victims, process and aftermath of genocide. Scholars describing the public's basic idea of the Holocaust often equate it to Schindler's List. Not without good reason, given the film's phenomenal popularity. But while there certainly are overlaps, the public's understanding of the Holocaust is not reducible to Schindler's List. Viewers are aware that this story is not the entirety of the Holocaust. even if the deportations, the ghettoization, and the hellish landscape of Auschwitz, which loom around the edges of the Schindler's Jews' experiences, do seem to somehow narrate a typical Holocaust story. As Christoph Classen has argued, part of the success of Schindler's List is due to the way that it invokes our imagination of the Holocaust. Its documentary aesthetic, and importantly, the inclusion of various scenes and stereotypes of haggling Jews, or of Germans mockingly shearing the beards and locks of Orthodox Jews, or piles of bodies. All of these create an atmosphere of familiarity, he argues. And he writes that these stereotypes in the aesthetic and in the content trigger effects of recognition. In so doing, he says, the film uses this kind of collective memory of images that pre-exists to help consolidate and rewrite at the same time. So Schindler's List is thus in conversation with Holocaust memory. It does not constitute it. As Classen notes, the iconic scenes and images that Spielberg deploys so effectively do in fact, quote, recall associations, myths, and meta-narratives that relate to the extermination of the Jews in the broadest sense. In these scenes and images, then, the perpetrators are typically crisply uniformed and efficient Nazis, and they display either the cold detachment of a committed ideologue or the brutality of thuggish murderers, or both. Spielberg's Amon Goeth does indeed personify both stereotypes. Scott Montgomery has remarked that as the embodiment of evil, these perpetrators are somehow faceless. They're infinitely interchangeable, which is part of the horror. And this phrase nicely encapsulates, I think, one key aspect of the mainstream representation of the Holocaust, that Nazis very often are presented as stock characters. They are necessary within the context of the narrative, but they're rarely explored in any real depth as historical agents with motives and psychologies. It's nice to note that this is gradually becoming less true, since there are some interesting recent examples of museums and films and books which explore perpetrators in more depth. But nevertheless, I think public understanding has yet to completely catch up. This general facelessness of the perpetrators contrasts with the humanizing representation of the victims. We are shown the histories and the fates of individuals, and we're encouraged to identify with them and their suffering as a way of understanding the impact of genocide. These victims are also depicted as a largely helpless and innocent and passive community. They're swept up in the Nazis' plans for extermination. Alongside this basic and very binary understanding of the perpetrators and victims of the Holocaust, there is a string of extremely recognizable, iconic scenes which depicts or documents how the Holocaust unfolded. So from Nazi rallies to propaganda posters to Kristallnacht to the familiar scenes of the degradation of the Jews, to the starvation in the ghettos, the deportation trains, and almost inevitably the gates and the barbed wire and the barracks of the camps of SS officers, striped uniforms, and gas chambers. Perhaps the most iconic images, the ones which have most shaped the post-war visualization of the Holocaust, are the photographs of the mounds of bodies discovered by the liberators of the camps, the crumbling remains of the camps themselves, and the piles of shoes and suitcases and hair and ashes. These icons are not just visual, of course. For example, the deportation trains are familiar from films, from survivor testimonies, and as artifacts in some museums. But what I want to suggest here is that these icons have also helped to create an understanding of how the Holocaust unfolded as a process. In a way, if you string these icons together, the scenes do in fact almost narrate the Holocaust by themselves. They chart a rough chronology from discrimination through to extermination. So these icons are familiar staging posts. They anchor narrations of the Holocaust within a very expected pattern. And this pattern means that you can recall them by association, even if they don't appear in a particular film or novel and so on. And in this retrospective view, the Holocaust appears as an inevitable progression through successive stages towards total annihilation. It implies a preconceived plan for genocide, rather than encouraging any reflection on the twisted road to Auschwitz. And because it does not tend to explore the perpetrators in much depth, it also usually explains the Holocaust through reference to the Nazis' actions rather than their motives. So these then are the expected scenes and scenarios of the perpetrators, the victims, the process, and the aftermath of the Holocaust. And the recycling of these familiar elements in the established formats means that the Holocaust is instantly recognizable. In Reinhard Koselleck's phrase, these conventions of narrative and form and content have produced certain horizons of expectation, and they structure how audiences interpret cultural representations of the Holocaust. Indeed, as Hans Kellner has noted, any representation of the Holocaust will have an intended audience, who is expected to understand the author's intended meaning, but who also themselves has expectations. And Kellner writes, "We expect to see perpetrators and victims differentiated, atrocities linked together, concepts defined and exemplified. We expect that certain events will not be made comic or absurd. We object when certain events are made tragic." And he argues that for Holocaust representations to be accepted as Holocaust representations, they have to be presented according to current social codes and protocols. Use of the old, the expected, secures the creation of the new by making its novelty nevertheless recognizable. Thus, we turn to the question of other genocides. How far are they only recognizable as genocide through recycling the expected scenes and scenery of the Holocaust? So as I've indicated, most of the scholarship that discusses the relationship between representations of the Holocaust and other genocides focuses entirely on direct, obvious comparisons, either verbal or visual. And while the shock of recognition produced by such similarities is powerful, this is not the only way in which the Holocaust has influenced the representation of other genocides. As anthropologists Andrew Strathan and Pamela Stewart have suggested, films and literature and so on resonate with us not only by presenting visual images, but by appealing to and conforming with basic scenarios in people's minds, mental habitus in the terms of Pierre Bourdieu. They are connected to cosmic schemes of good versus evil and the lessons of history. And here I argue that Western understandings of other genocides are rooted in the Holocaust because of these deeper structural correlations in their representation. Mainstream genocide representations largely follow the Holocaust script or basic scenario. And again, this centers around how the perpetrators, the victims, the process, and the aftermath are portrayed. And these four representational motifs recur all the way across films, exhibitions, photographs, and literature about genocide. There are, of course, some differences. In some genocides, there is a stronger focus on sexual violence that one might expect with the Holocaust. Or with more recent genocides, there's a trope of the UN peacekeepers' failure to intervene despite being witnesses. But because audiences are generally far less familiar with the basic historical facts of other genocides, replicating the Holocaust script means that the case study is still culturally legible or recognizable as genocide. And here I'm extending Kellner's argument. Also, repeating this plot or script where perpetrators are specifically coded as planning and pursuing the total annihilation of an innocent victim group is also what distinguishes the representation of genocide from the representation of other atrocities or tragedies. As I'll discuss later, this relatively narrow conception therefore excludes some cases of genocide, which falls outside the audience's horizons of expectation. In mainstream genocide representations, like most Holocaust perpetrators, the perpetrators of genocide are depicted in the most stereotypical terms, as unambiguously evil. This tends also here to serve as an explanation for their actions. They are also here rarely explored in any depth. As such, perpetrators remain at a distance from the audience. They drive the process of genocide without a proper explanation of why. Across films and literature and exhibitions and photography, the leaders are demonized. The names of Talat, Enver and Jamal Pashas, or Pol Pot, Nuanced and Comrade Dojk, or Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic become the anchors of the process. They are given names like the Butcher of Bosnia or Master of the Forges of Hell. And they are also depicted as driven, as cold, as uncompromising. Often they're accompanied by police mugshots, which frame them as criminals visually as well as rhetorically. Atom Egoyan, in his 2003 film Ararat, about the Armenian genocide, went one step further by framing the venomous Turkish governor in front of a fireplace with a flame behind, as this governor prepares to torture 2 young Armenian boys. The genocidal foot soldiers and collaborators, who are often unnamed and de-individualized, they appear as passive, faceless agents of an unseen and powerful organization. In Roland Joffe's landmark film of 1981, The Killing Fields, the Khmer Rouge cadre appear as automata, as passive machines following orders. In this scene, the Khmer Rouge children, who the main character, Dithpran, has witnessed being indoctrinated, tear up the tiny garden that he's been cultivating to try to stay alive. The actor who played Dithpran later commented that this young girl's expression, without her even knowing it, was so true to the behaviour of the real Khmer Rouge that it triggered traumatic memories for him. This same faceless machinery is true of the young Turks who are depicted in Egoyan's film Ararat, or the very recent film The Promise by Terry George. Those perpetrators who are directing the Armenian women and children to their destinations in the Syrian desert are portrayed in the same way. And the same is true again of the Bosnian Serb military commanders described by Western journalists in their memoirs of the wars in the former Yugoslavia. The BBC journalist Jeremy Bowen, recalling his time in Bosnia, wrote about the frequent roadblocks and checkpoints at which journalists would receive rough treatment. One day, he says, they attempted to reach the UN safe zone of Gorazde. Bowen remembered, "Many times I would turn up at a Serb checkpoint or in a village to be faced with huge hostility and pointed guns. The men were often big, physically intimidating, and heavily armed. Our process through eastern Bosnia to Gorazde was slow. At the last checkpoint before Gorazde, the Serbs came up with all sorts of reasons why we could not continue. There were mines ahead, there was shooting around the corner. My notebook says they were big men, big boots, big guns, beards, looking tough. One very angry man with grey hair shouts "Nix" at the camera." And to show that this is also a trope in the film, I've included a still from Michael Winterbottom's film, Welcome to Sarajevo. Perpetrators often appear in menacing crowds, like at these checkpoints, or with the gangs of drunk, whistleblowing Hutu who are gathered around roadblocks or churches in Rwanda. Or this mob, which appears in Terry George's The Promise about Armenia. Or, to give an example from literature, one of the best-known books about Rwanda is Jean Hatzfeld's A Time for Machetes from 2005. Hatzfeld spent quite some time in Rwanda interviewing former perpetrators. In his books, he has organised their quotes, their narratives, into thematic chapters, and he's more or less completely removed his own voice as an interviewer. So, as the scholar of Rwanda, Liane Fuji, has remarked, these killers' words seem to spring from a spontaneous and ongoing monologue. This sense of streaming monologue, in turn, helps to render these men as cold-blooded monsters. Once they become monsters, however, they are easy to dismiss as aberrant individuals who would never remind us of ourselves. And so the same can be said of the portrayal of most genocidaires in mainstream representations. These perpetrators are further distanced from us by detailed testimonies of sadistic tortures and cruel beatings from the victims. The Bosnian survivor Kemal Pavanic, who spent time in the concentration camp Omaska, recalls in his memoir how the guards at the camp very quickly turned into beasts of two breeds. The first would immediately jump on and crush their victims, and the second would toy with and keep their victims alive until the next day. Egoyan's film Ararat includes scenes where young women are stripped and forced to dance whilst being doused with petrol and set alight. Indeed, we seem to expect such behaviour of perpetrators. The French-Canadian UN General Roméo Dallaire, who was overseeing the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda in the run-up to the genocide, and who did everything that he could to get a mandate for action, recalls in his memoir his first meetings with the leader of the Interamwe, which was a militia group which was instrumental in that genocide. And he wrote, "I had made my way to the hotel, jostling through the ubiquitous roadblocks, drunken and downright mad militiamen, and hundreds of children jumping around, all excited among today's kills. These kids were being egged on to throw stones at our vehicles and yell at us as we stopped for the militiamen to open the gate. Arriving at the hotel, I took the bullets out of my pistol just in case the temptation to shoot them was too extreme, and went inside. The three young men Bagasora introduced me to had no particularly distinguishing features. I think I was expecting frothing at the mouth, but the meeting would be with humans." Dallaire is not alone in his confusion at expecting monsters and meeting humans. And indeed, this mirrors the common idea of Holocaust perpetrators as cultured demons, the phrase that the Auschwitz Sonderkommando member Zalman Gradowski used. The Yugoslav author Slavenka Drakulic, who, as a writer, I generally find very sensitive and insightful, reproduces this dichotomy in her coverage of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague. On the one hand, in her book, They Would Never Hurt a Fly, she insists that the perpetrators in the dock really are ordinary people who could be found or made in any society. On the other hand, her style of writing betrays her disbelief, and it creates a strong aura of dangerousness and deviance around them. She frequently expresses surprise that the perpetrators look ordinary. About one, she says, "Kovac really did look like someone you could trust to give your daughter a lift to the hospital." About another, Jesilic, she says that he looks like your best friend, your ideal son-in-law. But she cannot understand how Jesilic, this nice fisherman, ended up executing Muslim prisoners. And then she points out that fishing is not quite the innocent sport it seems. Fish have to be killed. The fish would appear from the water, wriggling helplessly on the hook. I can imagine him unhooking the fish and throwing it on the grass, then watching it gasp for air. Across all of these representations, then, the perpetrators are portrayed as deviant, and because their motives are rarely explored, audiences have to rely on notions of evil or ancient or ethnic hatred to explain the genocide. And despite the differences between these 5 cases, there does seem to be a basic similarity in the way that the Holocaust and other genocides are understood to unfold as a process. In fact, I think perhaps one of the more peculiar aspects of watching films or reading books or visiting exhibitions about genocide is that we already know the plot, we already know how it will end, and also how we are likely to respond to the narratives and the images that we are presented with. Most representations, mainstream ones, either follow or imply this same basic plot. Pre-existing tensions in a society deteriorate more or less rapidly, and those in power, who often only just came to power, plan and then execute a genocidal scheme which targets a minority, usually for death. This understanding of genocide is what I call in my book a closed narrative. It explains genocide by magnifying domestic factors, so the perpetrators themselves, their political ideologies, their fanaticism, and or some kind of tendency to violence in society, barbarism. While it magnifies those domestic factors, it ignores completely the international context for genocide, which can be shifts in global power, regional conflicts, or indeed the very modern goal of ethnically homogenous nation states. In actual fact, even the coverage of domestic factors is quite limited, since there is rarely much discussion of the impact of, for example, economic crisis or social divisions and so on. And the effect of all of this is to close off genocide, to distance it from anything which happens in normal Western democracies. This, of course, follows the intentionalist interpretation of genocide, rather than allowing consideration of the structural factors and elements common to all societies, which can be radicalized into genocide. As with the representation of the Holocaust, then, agency and causation are embodied in the perpetrators. Guilt is nationalized and extended to the entire perpetrator group of Turks or Khmer Rouge, of Hutu or Serbs. And it hides any differences within groups, such as politically moderate Hutu or Bosnian Serbs who identified as Yugoslavs, not Serbs. It also hides collaboration by other groups and the sheer diversity of perpetrators as well, all of which would make the ways in which ordinary people become killers more intelligible. The dynamic is also often reduced to a binary of one clear perpetrator and one clear victim, which means in part that other victim groups are usually left out of the story, and also, for example, that with the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, the Croats are normally left out of the story in favour of a Bosnian and Serb story. These horizons of expectation, particularly of the premeditated plan, are confirmed by the use of foreshadowing in some representations, usually as a device which heightens the sense of foreboding and emphasises genocidal intent. For example, in her novel Skylark Farm, Antonia Arslan adopts the voice of an omniscient narrator. In the middle of her discussion of an Armenian family's preparations for Easter in 1915, she interrupts the narrative to say, "Holy Saturday, the patient trap, agleam with barbed wire and congealed blood, is about to be sprung." In two of the films about Rwanda, a scene is reenacted where Romeo Dallaire is given information about the plans for genocide by a secret informant. Dallaire's own account makes heavy use of this foreshadowing, this idea of plan. And in the 2004 documentary Ghosts of Rwanda, an aid worker who was in Rwanda before the genocide said, "We all knew things were going to blow." So in these representations, genocide appears as inevitable and planned. It's also concentrated into a period with a very clear start and a very clear end point. This is reflected in the use of 1915 to talk about the Armenian genocide. You could give dates 1915, 1923, for example. Many Cambodian testimonies use the phrase Pol Pot time and say that it lasted 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days. Rwanda is known for having taken 100 days. So in all of this, there is usually no sense of the stages of deliberation, the gradual escalation, which produces genocide. And also some films and literature open right in the middle of events, with, for example, the downing of the president's plane in Rwanda, or the clearing of the cities in Cambodia. So there's little chance to explore the backstory. There's also overlap with the Holocaust in terms of how space is represented. Holocaust representations often focus on camps, on ghettos, on barbed wire, and tight spaces of entrapment, like the cattle cars or hiding spaces under floorboards or in sewers. And likewise, the deportation columns of the Armenian genocide have been called concentration camps in perpetual movement. The Syrian desert becomes the camp. Most representations of Cambodia take the interrogation prison Tuol Sleng, or S21, as their subject, and they ignore the dispersed everyday life of life and death in the Cambodian countryside. Rwanda representations focus on the churches and the schools and the hospitals that became sites of mass murder. And with Bosnia, most focus on either the experiences of the camps or the feeling of encirclement and entrapment in cities like Sarajevo, which were surrounded by Bosnian Serb snipers, or the other so-called UN safe zones like Srebrenica or Gorazde. So the similarities with the Holocaust are quite clear. In each, the actual spaces of violence are reduced to these circled spaces, and genocide is firmly caged within these bounded and also very distant spaces. This telescoping of genocide also focuses attention on those spaces where, because of the perpetrator-victim dynamic, there is also a very clear moral position. So while each of these mediums has a different potential to convey a very real sense of history, by, for example, exploring character and situation, by using affect, by challenging audiences to think slightly deeper or differently about the content, mainstream representations of genocide do not really exploit that potential. Instead, they tend to give us the most expected image of the unimaginable and easy explanations. They tend not to confront audiences with ambiguous situations, and instead position them as a horrified witness whose conclusions about the violence have already been made for them. And indeed, just as there are perpetrators, so too must there be victims. And as with representations of the Holocaust, genocide representations, mainstream, often focus on the victim's suffering. A common format, as with the Holocaust, is to portray the experiences of a few individuals as an emotive way of explaining the story, whether in feature films and documentaries, in museums, in novels and witness accounts, or, of course, in survivor testimonies. And these individual stories are always recounted against the backdrop of whole families and whole communities being deported or massacred, incarcerated, or forced into manual labour. I think the display at Tuol Sleng in Cambodia, the central interrogation prison, is a particularly effective example of this. Each room has board after board after board of photographs of victims. There were some 14,000 victims there. And the visitor quickly gains a sense of the scale of killing there, but is also encouraged to study individual faces and emotions. The museum at Srebrenica has selected 15 representative Bosnian Muslim boys and men out of the 8,000 who died. And it displays a short biography of each one, together with a personal item that was found with them in a mass grave. And here, I think the colours, the dark colours, the aesthetics, and the display techniques are very familiar to us from Holocaust exhibitions. And in general, this moving between the individual and the collective is familiar as a way of communicating the enormity of the event. but it's also a way of emphasising the scope and the extent of the killings, which is partly what will permit them to be recognised as genocide. In most of these representations, the victims are shown as helpless, innocent, and vulnerable. Within the dynamic of genocide, most victims have zero agency, unless they are heroised and valorised as resistors, such as in Franz Werfel's novel The 40 Days of Musa Dagh from 1933, or, for example, through the figure of Paul Rusesabagina in the film Hotel Rwanda. But this general depiction of a very one-sided affair is meant to chime with the public's understanding of genocide in terms of good and evil. The representation of survivors after the genocide only compounds this. Most representations draw on a standard set of strategies for presenting loss and trauma and devastation, and they invite intense emotional reactions. The survivors are described as the surviving remnant, the leftovers of the sword with Armenia, the leftovers of the killing field with Cambodia. They are lost or demoralised, outcast, demolished. Each of these terms connotes brokenness and burden and sorrow. The survivors' words reinforce this feeling, and they could almost just as well be Holocaust survivors' words. In the first paragraph of his testimony, his excellent testimony of surviving Srebrenica, Emir Suljagic writes, "I survived and many did not. I lived on in the same way that they died. There is no difference between their death and my survival, for I remained to live in a world that has been permanently and irreversibly marked by their death." As well as this familiar trope of living death is evidence of trauma. The Cambodian survivor Heng Nor, the one who played Dith Pran in Joffe's film The Killing Fields, writes, "If I thought too much in the daytime about what had happened, I had dreams that night. Hoi, his wife, died in my arms over and over and over. I saw my father tied to the tree and trying to tell me something, but afraid to speak. It didn't take much to set off my nightmares. The sound of water dripping from the faucet was enough." The aesthetics often used to portray survivors reinforces this sense of trauma and grief. And one visual convention is instantly recognisable. It's the portrait of a survivor in a kind of mute sorrow, with downcast eyes and a head turned slightly to one side. This is Alain Kazinikiaris' photograph of a Rwandan survivor who's named Eugenie. Alternatively, survivors are sometimes shown in extreme states of distress. Many films and images about Srebrenica, for example, begin with images of Bosnian women, widows, weeping, either as they wait for news or over their husband and son's coffins. And these are very well-worn conventions of representing victims and survivors that we also see within Holocaust representations. And this question of how survivors are portrayed finally leads me on to the question of the aftermath of genocide and the overlaps with the Holocaust. Beyond the focus on survivors, there are often iconic images and descriptions of physical remnants, piles of skulls and bones, personal possessions, with Rwanda discarded machetes in a pile on the floor, in the same way that we've come to expect such images of the aftermath with the Holocaust. With Rwanda and Cambodia, in images and in museums, we are shown ordered rows of skulls and bones in churches and in schools, and in the memorial stupa in Cambodia. With Bosnia and Croatia, we see in images twisted corpses that are being exhumed from mass graves. We also see bodies of Armenians laid out at the roadside. And these photographic representations are central, I think, because they somehow seem to depict the essence of genocide, of mass death, and indeed they also seem to serve as evidence for it. So as I indicated with the Srebrenica Museum, most genocide museums now focus on personal possessions and individualizing the victims. They have clothes, bunches of keys or toys or identification papers. In the Kigali Memorial Centre in Rwanda, the capital city, a few sets of clothing have been washed and kind of hung all by themselves in a room, and they're backlit very dramatically. At Murambi, a line of clothes hangs in an empty room. In Tulslang, there's a glass cabinet that holds very neatly folded clothes of victims, with more hanging by the side. In all of these displays, the personal possessions are displayed separately from the main analytical sections of the museums. So these displays are intended to communicate the loss, the enormity of loss, and to facilitate identification with the victims. And this focus on the remnants of genocide is one of the closest points of convergence between Holocaust representations and genocide representations. So, although audiences of these mainstream representations of genocide may be unfamiliar with the basic history of what they're watching, they're nevertheless quickly familiarized through the use of the Holocaust's basic scenario. And so this involves emphasizing the perpetrator's agency over broader structural contexts and underscoring genocide as extraordinary. All narrate genocide as exception, and this means that genocide is neutralized or literally domesticated. All of this has three main outcomes I want to suggest here. I'm sure there are more, but we'll do three tonight. The first is that by distancing genocide and the Holocaust from Western liberal democracies, these mainstream representations repeat and consolidate what is the Western interpretation of genocide, that it is the product of extraordinary people and politics in faraway places, and not something which requires us to introspect or to think about our own societal and political norms. Second, and linked, are the implications for genocide prevention. In my book, I demonstrate that most of these representations, at some level, situate themselves as a call to arms against genocide ever happening again. Most express hope, whether they're films or testimonies or museums, that if we raise awareness of genocide, we can better recognise and prevent it in the future. And these are entirely genuine and heartfelt hopes, and the audiences often respond in kind. And in fact, if you look at the visitor books in the museums in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Armenia, the phrases "never again" and "never forget" in multiple languages appear almost everywhere. So this normative framework of response to the Holocaust has also been extended to how people respond to other genocides. But as scholars, I think we must ask if these representations actually facilitate never again becoming a reality. And my argument is that mainstream representations often don't facilitate that. And that's because they sidestep these questions of how and why genocide happens, and thus how prevention might be possible. It's also because they encourage very emotional responses from their audiences of horror and shock and loss and sympathy, which are entirely necessary and good, but without channeling these emotions into a critique of genocide, it becomes more difficult for never again to be real. And thirdly, these deeper structural overlaps between the representation of the Holocaust and the representation of Armenia, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda have helped to make a canon out of the latter and to crystallize a Western understanding of the script of genocide. But that also makes it much harder to recognize those other genocides which do not fit this script. So if the violence shown is, for example, sporadic, drawn out over centuries, or dispersed over a wide geography, or does not necessarily result in mass death, it's even less likely to be recognized as genocide. And this is true, for example, with the settler colonial genocides in North America and Australia, or in cases where children are forcibly removed from their parents and transferred to another group, or I think also the ongoing genocidal violence in Darfur and in Burma against the Rohingya today. Certainly, I think films like Philip Noyce's Rabbit-Proof Fence, which is from 2002, and is about the fate of 3 young mixed-race children in Australia who are taken from their parents and who try to get back home. I think that film would really struggle to be recognised as a genocide film. So this representational framework both enables and limits the recognition of genocide. However, I just want to end with a discussion of some of the more engaged representations of genocide. There are many of these, and they reshape audience understandings of genocide in subtle and different ways. Some of them present survivors differently, they present perpetrators differently, or some of them encourage us to think about how the structures of violence in societies which produce genocide in the first place are actually still in societies after 1915, after 1979, 94 or 99. Because I've spoken a lot about perpetrators tonight, I will focus on a couple of examples where authors unsettle the usual representation of perpetrators. So instead of demonizing them, they show that perpetrators are ordinary people who make choices and decisions, and that they're often not unknown to the victims, indeed sometimes are their neighbours or their friends. And for me, the literature and the films coming out of the former Yugoslavia are often the most successful at this. They also have a very dark sense of humour, which I have to say I kind of appreciate. They often focus on neighbourly violence and the way that ethnicity suddenly begins to wrench apart friendships. Semestin Mehmedinovic's book, Sarajevo Blues, from 1998, portrays this sharp break that occurred on the first night of the war in Bosnia. On his way home on the tram in Sarajevo, after football practice, he writes, "A bunch of guys with stockings over their heads and Kalashnikovs aimed at us stopped the trolley. As I got out, I took a look at this motley crew, only to recognise the guy from my team who hadn't showed up. I was so taken by surprise that I had to repeat my question twice. 'Shluka, is that you?' Embarrassed, he kept quiet behind his stocking. My confusion lasted for a while. Instead of a guy I was supposed to hang out with over a few beers after a game, I found myself facing a real terrorist, occupying the very trolley I happened to be riding in. I couldn't figure out how to explain this to myself, this fundamental physiognomical change. But when the number of people began to multiply, the number of people who, like Shluka, started wearing stockings on their heads instead of their feet, I was no longer confused." Srđan Dragojevich uses a similar technique in his film Pretty Village, Pretty Flame. And this story follows 2 friends, Milan and Halil, one Serb, one Muslim, whose friendship is literally annihilated by the war. But Dragojevich chooses to explore not the war, but the people involved in it. It takes place in a tunnel where Serb soldiers have been trapped by Muslim forces, and it uses flashbacks to show how the Serbs in that tunnel came to be there, and how they came to leave their former lives to fight for a variety of explicable but not excusable reasons. Amongst these Serbs, there are 2 ignorant nationalists who are absolutely convinced of the necessity of war by propaganda and by political myth. There is a dubious salesman who decides to go to fight instead of his conscripted younger brother, because his younger brother is a nerd who would clearly not last 2 minutes at the front. There is a professor of literature, there's a former army colonel, and a druggie who quite literally falls into soldiering. He falls off a bridge into the tank and gets taken to war. It is quite funny. Between these stories, Dragicevic offers a potentially authentic account of how people get drawn into events and are changed by them. With Cambodia, there are in fact various films and books which attempt to humanize and explain the perpetrators. Doik, who is the leader of S21, the prison at Tuol Sleng, is humanized in both of the books that the Cambodian anthropologist Francois Bizot wrote. Bizot was conducting research in Cambodia before 1975, before the Khmer Rouge victory, and was in fact captured by them and ended up being interrogated by Doik before he took on this huge role once the war was won. Extraordinarily, Bizot was released. And in his second book, Facing the Torturer, he insists that Doik was not a monster but a human being. He was a young man who committed his life and his existence to a cause and to a purpose that was based on the idea that crime was not only legitimate but that it was deserved. And similarly, the 2010 documentary Enemies of the People, which is excellent, weaves together interviews with a number of Khmer Rouge perpetrators. The film's main informants are both village-level leaders, and they're very candid and upfront in their explanations of why they came to kill. There are also interviews with some mid-level leaders and also with the so-called brother number 2, Nuon Chea, who's been on trial in Phnom Penh recently. And Nuon Chea is very careful with his words, but he occasionally shows real emotion, anger, when he comes to describing the need that the party had to eliminate their enemies. And so viewers of this film are left with a realistic sense of how killing was possible and indeed understood as necessary. So those are just a few examples of the more engaged representations, and I focus mostly on how they disrupt these mainstream ideas about perpetrators. But what's striking about these more engaged representations that I discuss throughout my book is that they're almost all concerned with ordinary people and experiences. They tend to choose a close individual perspective or a microhistory to explore the diversity of experiences, or to show how social and political conditions influence choice, and the way that one's identity becomes enveloped by war and genocide. And crucially, they do not tell their audiences what to think, and they don't encourage a kind of horrified denouncement of the perpetrators. They leave their audiences to negotiate the issues of responsibility and guilt for themselves. So while mainstream genocide representations tend to follow the Holocaust paradigm, mainstream paradigm, in shielding their audiences from understanding genocide as very ordinary, these more engaged representations of genocide, in fact, unsettle that paradigm. And that's where I'll end. Thank you.
So, Rebecca, thank you very much for your presentation indeed. And now the floor is open for questions and comments. Bela will start.
Just your last examples there were kind of striking for the more engaged representation that you brought up, exactly non-Western examples. Are there any more engaged representations of the Holocaust, of the real Holocaust? I mean, of the Nazi Holocaust, because it's for me was very interesting that exactly the non-Western representations can obviously undermine it, and why do they? Why it's easier for them?
I think it's easier in part, in some cases because there isn't a national literary or filmic tradition, so that sometimes helps. And the kind of national cultural traditions, like with the Yugoslavs, that tends to have a very left-centre take on the world and uses black humour for that. So I think that in sometimes the kind of lack of exposure to the Holocaust paradigm, as I've called it, helps there. Did you ask whether there are Holocaust not engaged representations that I discuss, or?
No, if there's an example, for instance, I mean, to my mind, it came Jonathan Little. It's just like Holocaust, which is also kind of from a perpetual perspective and so on. Are there more examples, for instance, in popular culture, which undermine this paradigm?
Mm-hmm. Littell would be the one that I would have brought up. There are some other Holocaust. I sometimes think the film Good, which is, I think, 2006, about the Holocaust, explores, again, a relatively low-level guy who becomes a Nazi in the same kind of way. It explores his choice there to join the SS and to take part in the genocide. I think that's facilitated in part by him not being a high-level Nazi. So it's possible to kind of play with audience expectations like that. To flip it the other way and to think about representations of other genocides coming from the West and which are also engaged. I think the films by Anne Aguillon, who is a French-Canadian filmmaker about Rwanda, are also very good. She takes a quite anthropological approach. She spent a lot of time there and follows one community as they try to negotiate the aftermath of the genocide with the return of those who had killed back into the village. And she interviews people and lets them use their own words. And because she's embedded, and there are 4 films made over the space of 10 years, I think, you can get this real sense of trauma in the present that we often don't with genocide, because it ended on a certain date and it's all back to normal now. With her, it's very much about how trauma is still present, and how the prisoners who come home, who killed, someone's son, someone's husband, and so on, how these prisoners still form a demographic majority and are still threatening, but there's nothing that can be done. So there are examples of Westerners as well who can do this more engaged stuff.
Question now. I would like to follow Bela's question about West or Western narration. Does it a real Western narration or a kind of hegemonic one? Because I was wondering whether we can use the old classical category of East and West, having these examples. Because I have also some examples in my mind coming from the western part of Europe and having a really engaged attitude toward Holocaust remembrance. So I'm a bit afraid if we start to in German schimpfen, so the so-called Western narration, then we will leave this trace to understand the hegemonic character of the Holocaust discourse.
That's a big question. Yes, I think as I'm defining West, I mean mostly Western Europe and America. I don't want to just stick with Hollywood because it's broader than just that. And I think that there is no real convergence, I think, between East and West in terms of Holocaust memory and meaning, crucially meaning, or acceptance of kind of this same basic script or scenario and how it happened. And it is a hegemony, and that's the kind of thing that I'm also trying to critique and take apart if I can. Yeah.
But he wants to ask.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm sure you addressed this in the book, and I'm sorry, I will have to read it, but since you're here. So in order to treat, so I'm trying to clarify this for myself. In order to treat the Holocaust paradigm and compare it to all these other cases, you have to assume that it's stable. It's not a moving target. So do you take into account that the perception of the narrative of the Holocaust is also has been changing and it's still changing. So it's, it didn't stop with Schindler's List. So that was one. And the second one was, yes, so it's just sort of a ironic question. One of your conclusions said that all those cases that have not received this treatment, the Holocaust treatment, right? They might not be recognized as genocides. So should you recommend that all genocides should get the Holocaust treatment in order to be recognized as such?
Okay, I'll take that one first. No. No, I would just so much prefer that representations could take the material and try to do something with it without having to distort. Sometimes distortion happens, especially with Armenia, I think, because of Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide. In both scholarship and film, it's almost distorted the event itself. No, it has distorted the event itself in order to make it look like genocide. So I would hope that a filmmaker about North America or Canada or Australia could just take the material and have it recognized. But this is the problem. And your first question that I've blanked on.
The representation of the Holocaust is carved in stone.
Oh yes, sorry, movement. Yeah. Most of my examples come from the 90s onwards. Yeah. And yes, I think what's quite interesting actually is that there's a kind of delay, I think. It's around this time that I start to see more interesting Holocaust representations and some shifts, which is partly to do with the end of the Cold War, right? And other narratives coming into the public sphere. And also the rise of consciousness of the Holocaust that means that more and more narratives are there to be consumed. So while our understanding of the Holocaust is shifting, I think that ossified, static 1990s idea of the Holocaust is often what guides genocide representations because it's seen to be effective. So maybe one is moving and the others are not.
My question was really about by privileging the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
Do you contribute to this privileging? Rather than taking into account all the before the alternative ones, so say Horcha,
Yeah.
which was done exactly the same year and used the same black and whites, etc.
Just one ad hoc comment to Judith. I think it's very important to think about it that every generation has its own memory politics. And your project is the memory politics of the 1990s. And you are absolutely right, because in the post-war period, the heroes played an extremely important role in filmmaking. And then the perpetrators and the victimization or self-victimization. And as we now see, this self-victimization went global. And it is now the hegemonic discourse without any East and West. So this is the global discourse. Everybody is victim. And how we can change your position as a victim. So I think it's also important to know that, yes, every generation has a politics to use history for identity building, and of course, you're right. Visually totally different in many films.
I think in part with mainstream, I'm trying to get at, as I say, representations that try to appeal to a wide audience. And so part of that, if we're talking about how to select sources, is the ones that you see in bookshops that can easily be found with a Google search. When you put in Rwanda genocide testimony, what comes up? So I'm not sure that I myself am privileging this narrative, but it's the one that appears to me as part of my research process, which is not the normal archival research process, but nevertheless it was one. And also I think the museums that you go to, there's little to kind of choose between there, and they are very much following this kind of Holocaust aesthetic. So yeah, I'm not sure that I am. I'm trying to just follow and show. Yes, you made me think actually that it's not really just the 90s, it's also beyond that, because you get this shift from the kind of heroism through to victimization that's more current when I'm actually writing this thing, if you think about it, when I started 10 years ago.
Yeah, of course. So please.
Hi, my name is Gregory Weeks, and your talk was very interesting for me because I taught a course, and I would not call it comparative genocide. I called it humanitarian issues genocide, for the very reason that you get into all sorts of trouble when you start trying to compare genocides. And when I started teaching my course, I had worked as a war crimes investigator in Bosnia, and I started teaching the course in the mid-1990s here in Vienna. And I had all sorts of participants in the course who had survived the genocide on both sides, Serbians, Croats, Bosnians, Bosnian Croats, etc., Muslims. And what was interesting for me doing that is it was neutral territory in Vienna, so you could actually have these conversations. I never had any sort of, gigantic blow-ups. Because I was approaching it as an academic subject and trying to keep that out of it. That isn't so easy. And I think yours is the first talk I've ever heard that goes into the films, some of the things I've used. I had to put trigger warnings, on the syllabus because of all these problems. And I would be interested in sort of reactions you've gotten when you use this sort of comparative approach. Have people reacted badly to it? Have Holocaust survivors reacted badly? And how have, say, Bosnians or Croatians reacted to it?
My answer would be short because you are the first kind of audience, I suppose, that I've spoken to for a while, and as a kind of public as well. So I've not actually taken this anywhere outside Europe, so that has an impact. I kind of expect there to be some kind of blowback when it comes to the uniqueness and comparative issue. But I, for one, as a historian, and I also teach a master's course that is called Comparative Approaches to Genocide. Just started it this year. And so as an academic, I come out of the late 90s, early noughties, which is when the discourse started to move away from uniqueness and towards understanding comparison as being okay. So I'm kind of quite secure in that. I'm sure that it offends some people to have these things compared. But I think if the project is useful, if it tells us something that we don't know, if it shows differences as well as similarities, then if people will engage with you at that level, at that kind of analytical, intellectual level, then one can normally iron out kind of differences that way.
My worry would be my suffering is worse than your suffering.
Yeah. I mean, I spoke at Holocaust Memorial Day at a synagogue about the Armenian genocide denial, because the theme this year was the power of words. And the conversation after was very, very interesting in terms of how one, as a victim community, should understand one's victim identity and how large a part it should play, and what kind of differences they could see with Armenians today, the diaspora and themselves, and so on. So there was a tiny bit of kind of competition going on there, but not so much that it was difficult to deal with, which is quite, it was nice.
Other questions or comments? Kate?
Hi, thanks for your talk. I have a question about some of the pre-Holocaust roots of ingredients of this standard narrative. Because, I mean, since you're working on the Armenian genocide, I'm sure you're well aware of them, of the, atrocity volumes and the images of victims of pogroms laid out on a street, all these kinds of images that then later reappear in a, I don't know, almost like on steroids with the Holocaust. Do you think that there is any utility in tracing these sort of ingredients of this narrative, or of these tropes back even further beyond the Holocaust?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And I suppose it depends on, Stefan Erig's just written about the Armenian genocide within kind of German context. And so I wonder if it's worth doing it kind of on a national basis first and seeing where those interconnections kind of come through. Britain was very into denouncing the extermination of the Armenians for all of 4 years, until it sort of was far more convenient to do other things. So that would be the intellectual point there, I suppose. To what extent is this kind of causal, and to what extent is this actually just about the way that we understand tragedies generally? And the Armenian genocide could be preceded by others, and so on. So I suppose within the continuum between genocide and atrocity or tragedy, that's why I emphasize this point of a plan that you see with Holocaust representations. Certainly you see that with the public discourse around the Armenian genocide in 1915-16. It's extraordinary if you read the missionary reports from the time about how frequently they refer to the extermination of a people, and it's everything beyond, up to the word genocide and not using it. But that, as a set of representations, doesn't really seem to have kind of solidified into anything kind of forceful in society. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying that's really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Wayne.
Hi, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I have a question and a quick comment. So the first question is, you touched on this a little bit when you showed that picture of the Omarska camp in Bosnia. But in your book, do you deal with Western media reports, sort of live, sort of out of Bosnia or Kosovo, and how they depicted what they witnessed as a way to perhaps mobilize public opinion, or just sort of as they could relay their own experiences through what they've seen in the media? So that's sort of a question. And one comment, I appreciated the Yugoslav cultural references. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, I just want to note that the stalking idea of the guy on a trolley bus in Sarajevo, that's a widespread sort of trope in former Yugoslavia. For anybody in the 90s who appeared in politics with a criminal past, they would say, he wore his stocking more on the head than on his leg. And also, beautiful villages burned beautifully, that also comes from a sort of longer tradition. So perhaps the Yugoslav way of representing violence comes from some pan-Yugoslav tradition. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. As regards Western media, I refer you to chapter 3, where I'm probably really quite mean to most Western journalists because I am mean, because they have this habit of just parachuting in with zero context and parroting all sorts of kind of rubbish afterwards. And so I kind of lay that out, and then also I also talk about the way that they displace survivors' or victims' voices and kind of privilege their own and use victims' actual testimonies as a kind of backup for what they have to say. So it's very much about the kind of construction of a discourse there and their kind of fundamental misrepresentation of everything.
So if we do not have more questions or comments, I would like to thank you again for the presentation and the discussion as well. Mention that we will have so many programs in the coming weeks. We will start with the 28th of February with the 4-way invites in our institute. Franziska Karpinski will come and gives a lecture on masculinity, honor, and shame in the SS. And on the 12th of March, we will also have a workshop, Faschismus jetzt auch in Farbe, Nazis in Geschichtsfernsehen heute, und ich spreche weiter auf Deutsch. Das werden Sie in Depot in Breitergasse 3 am 12. Mai zwischen 19 Uhr und 21:30 Uhr teilnehmen. Und letzte Veranstaltung, das ich noch bemerken möchte, ist ein Simon Wiesenthal Lecture am 22. März hier in diesem Gebäude. Marie-Louise Van Ruska will kommen und der Titel ihrer Präsentation ist das Buch Goldmann, Ingeborg Bachmanns Darstellung des postnazistischen Wien. Also eine Studie, eine literaturwissenschaftliche Studie. Also Sie sind herzlich eingeladen, auch für diese 3 weitere Veranstaltungen. Vielen, vielen Dank für das Kommen.